cable's messing up again, too. I heard a shoot. Okay, the title of this message is Fearing God versus Fearing Man. And all of these messages I've been getting lately have been so progressively right in line with kind of where I've been. And God really spoke to me really loud in this. I got a message in my heart. Well, it's actually my message for me personally for Sunday about stirring up the gift or flaming the fire, or fanning the flame. But it comes from this right here, so I'm going to probably use a little bit of this Sunday. But we need to learn to conquer fear with fear. That sounds like an oxymoron, don't it? Copying fear with fear. What would you think if you had a little mouse that just terrified a big cat? That way out of balance, isn't it? I mean, the mouse has nothing to fear, to put intimidation or fear in the cat, does it? So I want you to think about this. How often do we act in a similar way when we allow ourselves to fear the wrong things? It's up to us to let fear in, right? And I'm going to give you some things that just really, really spoke to me. In Matthew, Jesus commanded not to fear them which killeth the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear, reverence. Those are two different words too. This one means, they actually both have reverence on them on this. But rather reverence or fear Him, which has the power and the authority to destroy both your soul and your spirit, soul and your body in hell. That really is an awakening statement, isn't it? Just think about it. That gets your attention really quick. Because as I build this up, that's going to really stand out. Fear is a human emotion, but it's also a powerful spiritual force that attacks our physical, our mental, and our emotional responses. And it messes with our spirit. Even though it is an emotion, it's also a very powerful spiritual force that Satan uses, fear. It's a spirit. If we give in to fear of what others think of us, or fear of bad things happening to us, or fear of bad things happening to those we love, or fear of maybe evil people, it'll paralyze us. It can cripple us physically, emotionally, and especially spiritually. And we were created as spiritual beings, in our senses, which operate our emotions, are supposed to be serving the spirit of us. And what Satan's done is turned us around and made us a servant of our senses. Because we serve the senses. I mean, basically we do. We follow our senses versus the spirit many times. And we're trying to reverse that, are we not? The senses were supposed to be giving in this earth suit to serve our spiritual man. And we're supposed to put our senses under control. Like you guys are doing that on Wednesday nights, coming back and telling your body that it's not in control. And that's just, part of it. We must guard our hearts against fear, and remember what Paul told Timothy. The next one, Matt. God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and of a sound mind. So ask yourself all the time when you get this fear coming into you, because I've been dealing with some of it today and yesterday, but God didn't give me that spirit. This isn't of God. And we need to know the definitions of fear, because you read in the Old Testament, we're to fear God, we're to fear God. And in the New Testament, you read, Paul says we don't have a spirit of fear. And God's not given us the spirit of fear. If we fear, we're not understanding fully the love. So what are those? One of those is the demonic terror fear. That's to be scared of, or to be terrified by it, something that would push you away. And the other fear is to have a great awe and a reverence. So God doesn't want us to be scared of Him. He wants us to reverence and respect Him. But you can't draw close to something or someone that you're scared of, because you will always have that protective wall up in your heart. The key to conquering the fear of man or the fear of things is to generate, and that's what this fan the flame is going to be about Sunday, is generate back, if we're lacking it, a proper fear of God. Because when we have a proper fear of God, then our fear, respect or terrified fear from other things will diminish. I've said that we're not to have a demonic, scared, tormenting fear, but to have a deep respect and awness, to kind of stand in awe. God is holy, and all of His dealings with man are perfect, just, and right, according to Psalms 19. So God is holy, and all of His dealings with man are going to be perfect, they're going to be right, and they're going to be just. In 1 John 4:18, I used this Sunday, and I didn't put the Amplified Bible, but there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear. In other words, having a perfect understanding of God's love for you will diminish fear, because fear has to do with punishment. You're scared God's going to punish you, is what the Amplified Bible says. But there is no torment or punishment from God. The one who fears God is not made perfect in understanding His love for you, is what that means. So we got to get to that place again where we really know God loves us, because that generates an activity in our spirit to really want to awe God, to put Him where He needs to be. When we have a proper reverence for the awesome love, power, and might of the Almighty God, and we recognize the fact that He is for us and not against us. He is for us, not against us. He's not our enemy. I'm having to go through that right now in a relationship deal. We learned some great boundaries, but at times in relationships, the husband and wife think you're the enemy. And, we're not. Well, we get that way with God. We feel like that we're His enemy, and we're not. He's for us, not against us. And when we're there, then we'll be able to understand what David said in Psalms 118. Now, Lord, I know that you are for me, so I will not be afraid of anything. Since you are on my side, how can anyone or anything else hurt me? And at that time when David was writing that, he was going through some horrific, unfair torture, basically, and having to hide like a fugitive. And at times when things seem unfair in your life, it's easy for you to get your thinking twisted and begin to fear God. I mean, a wrong kind of fear, to be afraid of Him. So David said, now I know, Lord, that you're for me. The greater reverence of God we have, the less we begin to fear anything else. But the greater fear and intimidation that we have of other forces, the less reverence and respect we'll have for God. I've heard it said before, we need to tell our problems how big our God is, instead of telling God how big our problems are. Whatever we magnify intensifies. That's just a principle that's into creation. Whatever you magnify, you're going to intensify. And that's what Mary said, my soul will magnify the Lord. Right after God had given her that word from the angel about she was going to have a child and be with child, she said, oh, Lord, my soul doeth magnify the Lord. And whatever you magnify gets bigger and bigger, doesn't it? A magnifying glass makes it bigger, but it also adds more power to it. You can set fires with it, with a magnifying glass. We should fear the Lord. One good reason, one of the main reasons, is because we recognize the superiority of His ways versus our wisdom and our ways. Think about that. That's that question we need to ask ourselves periodically, is how is my way working? Those are good questions. And then we choose to trust Him in His Word in our lives because we come to realize that. And we must get into the flow. I'm working on getting back there on this. I was a principled man. I understood the principles of God when I come out of prison because I taught that for 6 years. And just it was ingrained in me. And I don't talk much about the principles of God anymore. But He created everything that works on principles, laws, works on principles. And so once we get into the flow of the principles of God, we're into the flow of Him. That's when we get checked real quick. Wait, these principles, we'll know we're out of principle. That's not a principle of God. You understand what I'm saying by principle? Operating mode. Sowing and reaping is a principle. That whatsoever you sow, you're going to reap. That's a principle. So we need to get into the flow of God's principles. And then when we do, we're into flow with Him. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, having great respect and reverence for God is where wisdom begins. And the knowledge of the Holy One, that's what real understanding is. Understanding is the knowledge of the Holy One. And also Isaiah said the same thing. So, wisdom, knowledge is an accumulation of facts. You can have a lot of knowledge. But Solomon says true knowledge, true understanding comes from the knowledge of God. Right? Understanding is how, I've always heard wisdom is the teacher that tells you how knowledge works and what knowledge works for. Knowledge is accumulation of fact, and wisdom, tells you how to work it right. Because there's a lot of people that have a lot of wisdom of the world, but a lot of knowledge, but they don't have no wisdom, and they're using that knowledge in the wrong principle. We got to remember God is continually with us, and we got to know this: He's aware of our every thought, our every word, and our every action. That kind of wakes you up too, doesn't it? I listened to Joyce Myers today, and she excited me, man, about getting God back where He needs to be in the throne room of my heart. Because that's where things start happening. That's how everything happened to this moment, was because there was a time when that's where God was. And I've got to get Him back there to where on all of my decisions, on all of my principles. I'm talking about 24 hours a day. I'm aware of God being in my life. She said something about, I wished everybody, and she said she didn't get into this till later on in her ministry, but she wished everybody could experience, and I have at times in my life, could experience an ongoing, every second of your life, relationship with God. In other words, seeing His hand. This wasn't circumstances. This didn't accidentally happen. That didn't happen. This didn't happen. Those were Jesus Christ right there in my life, making this happen and avoiding this from bringing that person into my life, giving me that opportunity to bless somebody. That's living with a moment by moment by moment awareness of the Spirit of God in you. Isn't that awesome? Recognizing, how did I get way down here? I must have touched this thing. Okay. Remembering God is always with us. He sees every thought, word, and action. He knows them. In the end, it makes no difference what we accomplish in our lives if we haven't honored the Lord with it. Period. Look at what Ecclesiastes say. And when all is said and done, here is the last word. Worship in reverence the one true God and live an obedient life, for this is what God expects of every person. For God will judge every action, including everything done in secret, whether it be good or evil. And Paul says in the New Testament, or Jesus said, some sins are going to go before people and some are going to come behind them. I want mine to go before me where I'm already got this stuff dealt with. Right? So that's not hiding from God. You may be weak in the flesh in the moment, and you may be getting beat up in an area, but don't hide it like Adam did. Just say, God, I'm getting beat up in the flesh right here, and I need you. I need your help. I'm not hiding, and I'm not arguing or justifying this. It's wrong. Because he's the one that can help us. That's what he wanted Adam to do. In Proverbs 19:23, Solomon said, the fear of the Lord gives life. Gives life. Proper respect for God gives you life. And he that hath it shall abide satisfied, and he shall not be visited by any evil. That's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? You've got an umbrella of protection around you. Because why? Because you got God back on the throne. He starts making things happen for you when you step out in faith, because you put him in first place over what man thinks of you. Proverbs 23:9 says this, and it's got three of them. Leave it up there. It says, he also says, the fear of man brings a snare. I talked to Frankie today about some things in our relationship that's kind of drifted a little ways, and it's all my fault. But you should never be afraid to say something that's on your heart to somebody because you're afraid of their reaction from it. And I got that way wrong. So I've had to correct that. Everybody, and Debbie and I read a book last night on boundaries. See, I didn't even realize this. When someone is afraid to tell you something because they're afraid of your reaction from it, your reaction from it comes out of, because whatever it says you take personal, which I'm fixing to get into, and it creates a terrible feeling in you, and you take that personal. But that's just their feelings. That doesn't make it right or wrong. You need to let them share their feelings, and you don't own their feelings. In other words, you need to allow them to do that without them being scared of your responses. And you don't need to feel like you're rejected from it, because it's not a threat to you personally. It's just expressing how they feel about something, and you don't know how they feel about it if they can't tell you. Does that make sense? Because in my own relationship with Debbie, a lot of times, see, I don't even see it. I just think, well, it's about me, what I'm doing wrong, and this and that, and this and that, and this and that. And no, it's about how she feels about something. And so I wasn't really seeing that's her feelings. I don't get to dictate how she feels about something by my emotional responses. Because then you live in a real unhealthy deal, and it takes practice to do that. Then it says, if you fear other people, you are walking into a dangerous trap, the Voice translation. The Passion Bible says, fear and intimidation is a trap that holds you back. But when you place your confidence in the Lord, you will be seated in higher places of life. You'll go up. Why? You've put God back on the throne where he needs to be. This is where it all leads up to this. This is where it all gets down to. That's why you've got to put God back in. Most all of this comes from fear of rejection. If we're ever to be successful in our walk or our joy or our relationships, really have what we want to, the picture thing up there working, we have got to get rid of the fear of rejection permanently. It's at the base and the foundation of everything else. It's what takes God off the throne of your heart, because you've got a fear of man, and that comes because you've got a fear of rejection. And we got to get that out. And we got to get God back on the throne. Jesus warns us repeatedly that there will be those that reject you simply because you love him and you desire to live a life obedient to him. You can't foster that. You're in love with him, and you don't need to tamper that, and you're seeing that played out big time right now. Jesus tells us in Matthew 10:22, said, the next one. I must have missed it. Should have been right there. Okay, I missed it. I missed it. He says, ye shall be hated. And that word hates means when Jesus says you got to hate your mother and father, he says that at a time. That's not the kind of definition we got of hate. It's like you put nothing before me. In comparison to me, they need to be below me, despised. In comparison to me. But not our kind of hate or despising. So it says you're going to be always put down below everything else by all men of the world for my name's sake. So you just need to get that in your psyche right now. If you're going to live for God, there's going to be people that's going to try to intimidate you or that in them groups or whatever, and you need to just steer away from that. Because if you want God to bless your life and you see some things happening, you've got to get Him back on the throne. We should rejoice because we see so clearly the truth and the consequences from a life lived in rebellion to God. And man, many of us have lived that, and many of us get out from under that umbrella of protection and get on that other path, the bad path, the death and curses. And we know, we experience the consequences of it. You know, you can experience the consequences of something if you just step on that path for a minute. And the higher profile you are, the quicker you feel the consequences of it. And if you got the Spirit of God alive in you, He's going to really start talking to you. Living for Christ is something we should never be ashamed of or we should ever fear anybody else. We're living in a time, I sent a text to the men that I want to really talk to us about tonight. I think God has got spirits that He's wanting to pour out on men. We got women in here that are getting strong women. We got some strong warrior women in here. And so Debbie's done a great job in multiplying that spirit of being a strong woman warrior. And hungry. I mean, just hungry for God and things like that. So I want to generate that spirit more with our men. But God's got spirits of Moses, spirits of Elijah, spirits of John, Peter. He's wanting to pour out on men right now that will just position themselves and get Him back in the throne of their heart. And they be serious about this. He's going to do it. I know He's going to do it. I know He wants to do it in here. Man, I hope this isn't broke too. Many times, rather than fearing rejection for Jesus' sake, we fear personal rejection. This is mine. I didn't put it up, but Proverbs 29, we've already saw it, says, the fear of a man bringeth a snare. And that's personal rejection. The danger that comes from this trap is the temptation to compromise our godly character, our godly convictions, and to remain silent when we need to be speaking. There's times you know you need to be speaking in crowds or a testimony to somebody, helping somebody, or maybe in some truth, if that moment's where you need to be. And if you have fear of personal rejection, it'll paralyze you. We do that because we want to be accepted by everybody. And you're not going to be. So here's what we need to do. We need to trade our reputations for God's. We need to trade our expectations for His. And we need to focus on what He thinks of us versus what the opposite of that is. And so if we know we're carrying His reputation and not ours, we know we're in line with His expectations, and we know He loves us, we know He's with us, we know we trust, we know He desires the best for us, then we get in line with His expectations, and then we focus on what He thinks of us versus what the others think. Look at what Isaiah 51 said. Who art thou that thou shouldest be afraid of a man that shall die, and you forgettest the Lord thy Maker? Man, I love the terminology of the King James in that, doesn't it? Who art thou that thou shouldest be afraid of a man that dies, and you forgettest the Lord thy Maker? So, here's some things. What does God say about us as believers? He says, number one, we're chosen. We're accepted. We're redeemed. We're forgiven. We're loved. We're adored. We're cherished. He says we are small gods. We are part of His household. We're part of His family. We're seated with Christ in the upper chambers in the dimensions of heavenlies. We are the pinnacle of God's workmanship. Man, that's just to name a few. So recognizing God's acceptance for us is foundational to conquering the fear of rejection by others to gain self-acceptance. So we've got to recognize God's acceptance of us. Self-acceptance. Believing that God created me with all my unchangeable characteristics in the way that most glorified Him. We got to believe that about ourselves. This plays an important role in overcoming the fear of rejection. An interesting aspect about human nature, this is good, is that what we believe to be true in our hearts, we will find evidence to support it out here. Now, what's that mean? That's why it's so important that we implant the truth in our heart. Because whatsoever a man believeth, he will create it and do it. So, you will create evidence to back up what you believe in your heart about yourself. That's why we got to get away from negativity. That's why we got to get away from, saying your mistakes. You're saying you are that. Whatsoever a man thinketh, he'll create the evidence in his life to prove that he is. Because here's what happens. Perception produces projection. So how we perceive ourselves will be exactly how we project ourselves. That's why it's so important we plant the right seeds. As Solomon said, I said, whatsoever we believeth in our hearts, so we. If we reject the way God made us, we will expect others to find us unacceptable too in that area. Automatically. We just go into it with that spirit that you automatically accept me unacceptable there. Before long, we'll be experiencing this rejection from others in our day-to-day interactions with them, even when this was not their intention at all. We'll generate it. We'll help make them believe it. And so that's why it's so important for us to know who we are. The fear of rejection from others has its roots in the self-rejection. We have to begin to love ourselves. Jesus tells us we are to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. We can't love our neighbors if we don't really love ourselves. And to love yourself, you've got to get in sync with God about He made you beautiful, fearfully, wonderfully made for a purpose. Whatever He's designed you to do, He's given you the ability and the talents to do it. And whatever your unchangeable features are, He did it to glorify Himself. There was even one little boy that was blind that the disciples brought to Jesus and said, who sinned, this boy or his family? And Jesus, basically said, we got an enemy that blinded him, but this was for God's glory, that He could be glorified. And that one ailment glorified God because He healed him. One of the most effective ways to overcome the fear of rejection is to become a channel of God's love and acceptance to others. He tells us it's more blessed to give than receive. When we begin to comprehend the depths of God's unconditional love for us and accept that and believe it, we can then allow God to transform our feelings of rejection into motivations to encourage others. Man, I'm going to end with this. Here are just some practical ways to demonstrate that we accept others. Because listen, most everybody goes through this. There's been beauty queens. It's one Miss America that had self-rejection issues bad. So everybody goes through this, but one of the ways to overcome it is you start helping others accept themselves. Look at this. Greeting people by name with a joyful smile and enthusiasm. Giving genuine praise for positive accomplishments and for good character qualities. This is people that you're around. Offering to do tasks that you know they would appreciate. Compliment them on their positive aspects, on their characteristics, or you notice something they've done. Let's believe what God says is true about us. Let's receive the love that He wants to give us. And let's look for ways to show His love and His acceptance to others around us. And that's the greatest way to overcome and not even think about self-rejection. And you get caught up in that, you won't even really, you'll be in the flow of God's principles. You won't really even notice when there's things going on around you that would normally used to, you would have been attacked by it, took it personal. Because you're just caught in the flow of doing what Jesus did. Jesus paid very little of attention to any negative stuff. He just walked and it was all around Him, but He was in the flow. And His disciples was with Him. And He never really attacked any negative stuff to Him. He just said, tell them what to go and just dust your feet off and go. He didn't get into the flow of negativity. He kept everything going for His mission was to bring God's love and His acceptance to other people. Did y'all get anything out of that? Amen. Good. Well, the men, we're going to do this lesson because we're still on what makes a real man. And I lost my book, Kenneth. And you're going to have to let me borrow your book tonight. I'm going to make copies for next week. But this